Welcome to the We Shape podcast. I'm Katie. I'm here with our co-hosts Tyler and Nina.
Hey guys.
Hey everybody.
I have been waiting for this podcast. I'm not going to lie. I'm very excited about our guest today. We originally had her scheduled, and then we got norovirus.
Oh, that was a bummer.
And so she was so patient and graceful with us and has rescheduled, and the day is finally here.
Yes.
So I would love for Nina to do a formal introduction.
Yes.
Nina discovered this guest, and I am just so grateful and so excited. So we're just going to jump right in. We have some time constraints today, which is totally fine. But I want to make sure we can maximize this conversation.
Hi, everybody. Today we have with us Dr. Hortencia Jiménez, who's from Huichol ancestry. She was born in the Sierra Madre in the state of Nayarit, Mexico, and immigrated to the United States. She's a first-generation college graduate, earning a BA, MA, and PhD in sociology. Dr. Jimenez is a sociology professor, speaker, author, podcaster, health coach, and mother. She is currently working on a co-edited undergraduate textbook on Latinx studies with Sage Publishing, a leading press in the social sciences. Dr. Jimenez researches writing, has appeared in academic publications, and has numerous awards and recognitions for her work in the Latinx community. She was featured for her undieting work in Bellatina News, a leading Latina digital platform, as well as Canvas Rebel. Dr. Jimenez has been interviewed by First Gen American, Latinos en Vivo, Radio Bilingue, and has been on numerous podcasts. Dr. Jimenez's work centers on dismantling diet culture from a social and racial justice framework and helping Latinxes heal their relationship with food and tapping into their ancestral wisdom and integrating an intuitive eating framework. You can follow her on Instagram and TikTok at Dr. Hortencia Jimenez and listen to her podcast, Dismantling Diet Culture, Fuck Being Calladita. And with that, we would love to welcome you. We're so happy you're here.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me and being willing to have an honest and raw and vulnerable conversation, I think, for all of us.
Yeah, we are so excited you're here. And I think the primary reason is, I knew this was going to be a heavier podcast. Some of these topics are really heavy, but they're necessary.
Absolutely.
And at We Shape, our entire intention is to take people off of the path of dieting and weight loss and this idea around external validation that the media and our culture really want us to follow. And we talk a lot about the concept around the toxic fitness industry, how we used to participate in that. Mm-hmm. We've worked through our own shame and lessons around those years of our life and have really learned and can pave a new path. But I try to remind people that the fitness industry and what they sell us does not exist without the cultural values that we collectively have as a community. Mm-hmm. So that is, in my opinion, and maybe you can help me, is the root of some of the ways that the fitness industry operates. And so we've talked a lot about this concept that those values are rooted in sexism, racism, and capitalism. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'd love to spend some time. We've talked a little bit about the capitalistic part, so I'd love to spend some time diving in your expertise and getting, all of us, including Tyler, Nina, and I, educated on the racist and sexist part of these values. So I don't know where you want to start, but that's where I'm really hoping we can go today.
Yes, absolutely. First and foremost, I want to begin by acknowledging that I live in Monterey County, home to the SLN and Cosanoan Nation. I am of Huichol ancestry, and I bring in this space all my multiple identities and intersecting identities, and that's how I want to start off. And I think that's an important lens to have in all the conversations on dieting and anything that has to do with social and racial justice issues. So having said that, the intersections of diet culture, which is connected to the fitness industry, is these intersections. We cannot talk about dismantling diet culture or on dieting if we don't acknowledge, like you said, this collective ideas or values that are rooted in oppressive ideologies that at the foundation is the elephant in the room that we never want to acknowledge or talk about, which is white supremacy. And as a woman of color, even saying that in this space or in any space is always putting myself vulnerable in saying it, right? So if we acknowledge first and foremost that all of us in this space agree that white supremacy is the root, that informs everything, even the foundation of this country, right? So looking at dieting, looking at the fitness industry and diet culture, the intersections of anti-fatness is rooted in anti-blackness, is rooted in patriarchy. So we cannot discuss just one element without looking at all those intersections. So if you want, we can begin.
I would love to. And I just want to say, I think sometimes these topics feel intense because it's shameful for white people to sit in the concept of the of white supremacy being the root. And I just want to encourage people that if you identify as a male or as Caucasian or white, it's okay to just face that. And we had to face our own stuff around the capitalistic nature of our previous business models and the toxic culture we were participating in. But if we can't allow the shame and the emotions to just be what they are, we're not going to make progress.
Yeah.
And just, speaking from the perspective of being the white male on the stage here, I think it's really important that we try to just hear the experience of others rather than take that as judgment of who we are.
Exactly.
And I think it's really important because I think that that's the trigger that I was kind of taught is judging who I am. I didn't do anything wrong. I was brought up this way. And so if we can just remove that and just say, how do we listen? How do we hear? How do we create empathy and vulnerability? I think that's a really good place to start.
I think the end goal would be, and correct me if I'm wrong, would be to actually take that shame and turn it into a way that we can use that power to help other people.
Yes.
And to bring awareness to these topics and not to sit and it's like shame gets us stuck. And if we can just acknowledge and accept it and then use that power to help the collective whole, I think that's where change can really happen.
Yes. And this is a great pivot, right? Is that change begins with us at the individual level, right? So being a sociologist and looking at systems of oppression. So that's another area that I do want to talk about as well. But change begins with us at the individual level. And I can't help to think how we've been two big major institutions that have shaped our racial lens and how we see the world and how we see bodies and people is the family. Family as an institution plays a big role. So speaking from personal experience, I grew up in Watsonville, which is only 25 minutes from Santa Cruz, 30 minutes, and the demographics are vastly different. I had a culture shock every time I would come to Santa Cruz as a child. I grew up in a predominantly Latinx community, a farm worker community, so discussions around race weren't very explicit. I knew what my positionality was in society based on those conversations, based on how I was treated. So my family didn't explicitly talk about race. It's what we experience and in those spaces and then education system. So what I'm saying here is that our families play a big role in our racial awakening. Our racial socialization, Black families, other families don't have a choice but to talk about race. Like I do that to my kids now. Like Mijo, I have a 6'2" brown boy. He's tall, and I've had to have these conversations of like, you may be perceived as a threat because of your body. Those are hard conversations, So parents of color oftentimes have to have these conversations. We can't protect and shield our kids from not talking about race, and maybe that's different if grew up in a predominantly white space, white family, which is the norm, which is the dominant in our society. So you don't have to engage in these conversations. So I think we need to acknowledge that the hard work begins at home, right? And if you weren't talked about this growing up, it's not too late, right? So having the courage to have these conversations. And then the second institution is the family. The second institution is education. The education system also omits like very hard conversations about race. We learned the superficial, Cesar Chavez, Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, Gandhi, the main figures. But other than that, the curriculum doesn't. Our students, as a professor, when they come to my courses and we're talking about sociology and oppression, their students are like, and I'm asking them, what do you think, creating these safe spaces? And they're not ready. They don't feel comfortable. So, the education system and the family, those two reinforce and make it difficult for our students, and they become adults, to engage in these conversations. So I think it's never too late, and that begins with us, and it begins being vulnerable, right? And allowing ourselves to be vulnerable and compassionate at the same time, right? I think that's important. And people of color, minoritized communities, we haven't had that privilege of being comfortable in these conversations. So even I had this honest conversation with Nina when she reached out, and I said, Nina, you know who I am? Like, this is the work that I do. I'm being very honest because I've had other white folks reach out, and halfway through an interview, they realize, oh, this is not what we wanted.
Yeah.
And then I'm the vulnerable there, you know?
Yeah.
And so I don't know if went off on a tangent. I think I
No.
did a little.
I have a couple questions. It really touches me when you say you have a son and you have to have these conversations. And that brings a lot of awareness to the people who don't have to have these conversations. And I'm wondering if you'd feel comfortable maybe sharing any other conversations you have had to have maybe with your parents or with your children that people can just have more awareness around what's actually happening.
And I can only speak from my experience as a woman of color, as all these different labels that I use to identify myself as a Mexicana, as an immigrant, as indigenous, as Latina and Latinx. It's a whole nother conversation. But growing up, I didn't have these conversations. I was ill-equipped when I got to the university. When I went to San Jose State University, a very diverse institution, I didn't have the skills. I had the knowledge and the experience. I didn't have the academic language to articulate my experiences. I don't want to wait for my students. I don't want my kids to wait until they're 18 or 19 to have these conversations, to have the language to articulate their lived experience, because most of our lives, our experiences are gaslighted as unreal, that didn't happen. And so because of those experiences, I make sure, as a passionate professor that I am in my courses, to really put this front and center, and always have had these conversations. So with my kids growing up, they're quite aware of race, of gender fluidity, of all the isms, because they're getting what I didn't get, and now they're experts. They say, "I know, Mama. I know." We're watching a movie, and they're like, "I know, Mama." That's their way of shutting me down. But I at the end of the day, I only think that I'm doing a good job as a mother, and as a professor, having these conversations with all my students. And I do want to say that it has been difficult for both students of color, Latinx students, when they're like, what do you mean about race? Talking about race or racism, this doesn't exist. And, getting that resistance both from students of color and also from white students, because they didn't have these conversations growing up. And then they have a Latina professor, right? Then they have a woman of color telling about white privilege and telling about things that no one else has told them. So there's so much resistance, so many layers.
That's the shame.
It is my responsibility. The shame and the guilt and the white fragility that doesn't allow white folks to engage in these conversations. And I think it's so important, because we people of color always have to talk about this.
So do you feel like one of the important things, and there's many important things that I've heard you say, like around educational systems, and but Tyler and I have talked about this a lot, around just like being able to use the privilege that we have to create allies, right? And so, Tyler and I, for instance, have had conversations with other people where I've brought up racial injustice issues, and I, quite frankly, was looked at like a bitch. And I was like, I need your white male power to become an ally, because had you been in that conversation with me, you would have been looked at as a thought leader. But because I'm a woman advocating for this, instantly I'm shut down by the white male, right? And that's what's hard, is like, I want to figure out a way that we can bring allies into this so that real change can happen. And I don't have the answer, but I just...
We're doing it right here.
Yeah. Okay. That's good to know.
You're doing the work right here. I did mention understanding like systems of oppression and marginalization, and I want to kind of center on that, and as a way of what it means to be a white ally in all these spaces of racial justice. First and foremost is acknowledging our dominant identities or privileged identities. All of us in this space have privilege, different levels of privilege. So I think change begins there. And we cannot have allyship or what's the concept? I can't pronounce it. It's moving beyond an allyship. Conspirator,
like co-conspirator,
like when you're co-conspirator,
co-conspiring.
So it sounds like you're up to like a crime or something.
We can edit that if you want.
No, it's perfect.
But we can't move into allyship, into this action, by first recognizing like who in this space is straight, you know, who in this space is white. So dominant identities and privileged identities based on our society. So thinking as a sociologist is white. It is, remember, all this is a social construct, right? But whiteness, heteronormativity, social class, if you're upper social class, if you're able-bodied, if you are in a smaller, thin body, if you speak English, if you're a citizen, y'all, like all these are privileges, right? Some we earn them and some we inherit, you know, when we're born. We're part of that social group.
Oops.
And then, or marginalized identities, even within the dominant groups, even within whiteness, even being as a white woman, you have less privilege than a white male, right? So that you see those intersections. And if you're queer, and what if you're a fat woman, right? And you're in a bigger body. So you have marginalized identities. However, you're still part of the dominant group in our society. So what does that mean then for a woman of color who might also speak English, who may be straight or whatnot, but she's racialized?
Can I just
she has
repeat
experienced
something back?
systematic discrimination in this country.
Can I just repeat what you said, and you can tell me if I got this or not, just because I want to make sure that I clarify for myself and the listeners as well. I think that this conversation can't be had unless we're willing to say there are a lot of different things that you can have privilege or injustice and not privilege in. And where you are at in your life and where you were born and how you've acted in your life is going to put you in some spectrum of these things. And race is one of them. Your societal standing, probably due to how much money you make or the environment you live in. Your sexual identity, how you look, your gender, et cetera. It all kind of plays a role in this.
Absolutely. That is the hard work. The hard work begins with each individual unlearning, right? It's how privilege operates is you don't have to think about those privileges. And I recognize my own, right? So then how they operate and how they can lead to inequality. And you're trying to help, but you're causing harm because you haven't done the work.
And like we've talked about, Tyler and I talk about this stuff a lot, and I try to like use this analogy so that we can become allies, right? And I don't know if it ever resonates with you, but it's this idea that like you're a wealthy white man, right? And I'm a wealthy, able-bodied, thin white woman, and I feel the gap between us dramatically. Because I identify as female, but I only have one factor, right? And to feel that gap is really intense for me.
Yeah.
And I try to use the analogy of like, I'm not trying to take the white male down. I'm trying to explain that I'm actually second in line to you, and I feel the gap. So what does that gap feel like for other people with more than one factor like that? What if I was gay? What if I was black? What if I was poor?
Let me ask a question. I'm really curious about your answer to this.
Those are called or intersecting identities, right?
How do you help people understand the gap when there's not much of a gap for them?
That's because that's how privilege operates.
Right. Like I heard you say something powerful there. You said before Katie talked, you said you don't have to think about privilege because you're privileged.
Yes.
And so then you have no awareness of what it feels like to be unprivileged. So how do you build that awareness?
I'm going to take it a step further because I feel like when I have these I'm sorry. I feel like when I have these conversations, I have access to a lot of wealthy white men in this industry. And I get triggered a lot, and I'm trying to work out how I can create allyship. And so one of the things that comes up a lot when I do get brave a lot and bring these things up, and I tend to make people very uncomfortable, and I'm just don't care anymore. But what do you do when you bring this up with someone and they go, well, I was poor as a child, and so like I know what that feels like, and you're like, but oh man, like I feel like I need help in replying to like when they do this comparative suffering game.
Yes.
Or I was abused as a child, or I was this, and I'm like, ooh, you're moving down a different path. I don't want to do comparative suffering. I want you to.
Exactly. Part of this is difficult, right? So there's things that I can do as a woman of color in certain spaces, and then the responsibility that white folks have with other white folks, right? to help them unlearn a lot of these messages and recognize their privilege. It's I guess centering and saying that privilege doesn't mean that you didn't have a rough life. You know, it is being compassionate, say, yes, I get it. I understand that you're in this because of your hard work, everything that you did, but you also need to understand that being privileged doesn't mean that you didn't have a rough life, that you haven't been discriminated, or you haven't been mistreated. What becomes very difficult is when folks aren't willing to engage in these conversations, to have these open conversations, and you can only do so much as well. So it's also like you need to take care of yourself and your well-being.
It's
you
hard
know what
because
saying?
I'm like, I also feel like it's part of my job because I'm like, okay, so we've oppressed all these people and then we're relying on them to educate us.
Yes,
like Nina and I've talked about this a lot. I'm
yes.
like, it just makes me crazy. So I feel like part of what I want to do is contribute to the solution.
Yes.
And since I'm second in line, I feel like it is my job
need
to
to
create allyship with white men.
Yes.
This is not about me taking white men down. I think that people instantly assume that that's my intention. And so I'm just,
Defensiveness is the
like how do
reaction.
we
Yes,
have these collaborative conversations if people are just not available for them?
You know, and it's on
Move on to someone who is available.
Yes, and acknowledging that perhaps that they're not ready to have these conversations.
That's upsetting for
I
me.
also just, you know, I've watched you have a lot of these conversations. And what I try to pay attention to is where somebody's at when they're listening to you. Are they throwing up their armor and their shields and stuff like that? And what's happening there? And what I think is really valuable for me already in this conversation is recognizing that you're talking about a conversation and maybe it's predicated on racial injustice. And they're like, oh, but I came from a poor family and I was abused and all this stuff like that. And so what they're saying is like, I had economic injustice, but you're like, no, I'm talking about racial injustice.
It's not the same thing.
And it's not the same thing.
Exactly.
And so I think it's really important that in those conversations, we bring it back to there are, you know, social status, there is racial injustice, there is sexual orientation injustice, et cetera.
Yes, actually, to just elaborate on that, when we think about systems of oppression, and if you want to begin having those conversations, is yes, I acknowledge that you had a rough life, you were perhaps mistreated, you know, you experienced oppression because of your social class. However, your whiteness has protected you from other, you know, systemic issues.
What would that
in
have been
society.
like if you were a different race?
What if,
or a different sexual orientation or something
So
like that.
we need to take into account race, gender, sexuality, immigration status, you know, citizenship.
You said language too.
Language.
That's
We're
something
privileged.
so important to think about.
So I always come into these spaces. I'm an immigrant. I am Mexican. I'm of indigenous ancestry, and some of these privileges I've earned them, and is education, English. Like just speaking English is part of. It's a privilege in this country.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I think I want to go back to my point of why I feel like the allyship is so important is because I know Tyler has watched me have this conversation and he goes, oh dear, Katie's coming out. And I'm really trying to refine my passion so that people can, but I also have to acknowledge some people, like you said, are just not ready.
Yes.
But again, back to the point of like, getting that allyship in some way is so powerful because I guarantee you some of the conversations you've watched me have, if I was a man, they would have been like, what a thought leader.
Yes.
But because I'm a woman, they're like, oh, we have to hear this bullshit again. And I'm like, damn it. So I want to continue. I'm so grateful that we're able to have this conversation. I'm so grateful, Tyler, that you're able to show up out of curiosity and join that allyship because I do believe that it's that partnership and co-collaboration that makes change happen. And that's what we're ultimately trying to do is look through a different lens.
My hope is to provide the clarity of what it feels like to be ignorant of this stuff.
Yes.
Right? Because when somebody first hears this, I watched you had a conversation with my dad and he was trying really hard to get it and he was just not there. Right? And I'm just like, I think most people, like you said, their shame and their guilt pops up.
Yes.
I know how that feels.
Yes.
I know how that feels to be like, whoa, I didn't do this. Like I was just born into this.
Exactly.
Right?
Or my ancestors or, you know, it wasn't my fault.
Right. And so I think it's important because that's the piece that prevents somebody from listening.
Exactly.
And so if we can figure out what's going on that's preventing them from listening, then we can help relate to their experience. And if we can relate to their experience, they might be able to relate to whatever it is that we're trying to talk about.
That's why I always say that shame just gets people stuck.
Yes.
For
Shame
sure.
is a really hard emotion to deal with.
Fragility and guilt. Yes. And, you know, and if I can be candid, and I'm nervous to even say this, giving my intersecting identities, but like, well, white folks have that responsibility to work with other white folks to have these conversations. And I appreciate so much being in this space to be able to even have this conversation with the three of you, because I can see the domino effect and the impact it's going to have in the community and in your podcast. it shouldn't fall on the shoulders of other marginalized identities of other, people of color, because at the end of the day, they're not going to listen to me, even though I have a PhD.
So, this is so important.
You're like, I'm a doctor.
I have a PhD, and even then people.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Had it been you in that conversation, it's like they would have listened even less. And that's why I'm saying, like, we need the power of the white male. This is not about taking it down. I think that people feel like we're trying to take down white men, and I'm like, we're not. We're trying to create allyship.
They're not going anywhere, even if we really try, to be totally honest, unfortunately.
I'm like, no, we just want to create allyship because your voice has a greater chance of being heard.
And I feel like I feel your passion, and I can also feel your frustration, and I just want to tell you, I don't want you to give up. I want you to
I don't think that's possible.
Yeah. Oh, well, you don't have to worry about that one.
You're talking to the right person.
To continue to be consistent and doing this hard work. And when you think like, this is hard, I can't do it, or I'm tired, other people don't have that privilege.
Exactly.
Right? So
they don't get to stop.
So you do have a responsibility to continue to unpack and to have these courageous conversations, because if they're not listening to you, they're not going to listen to a Black or Latino or a queer folk or even a white fat woman, and or a woman in a bigger body, because
Exactly.
who they
I
are.
have curiosity to kind of bend that direction a little bit around, something that I've heard you talk about on your beautiful social media page is like cultural foods having like weird shame around them, and how like that's so not okay. Like, because we do talk about intuitive eating here on this podcast and different shaped bodies and things like that, and like that like it's okay to enjoy the things that like your ancestors feed you, and that like those foods are good and nourishing in a different way maybe than I don't even want to say than nutritionally. Like they feed your soul maybe. And how does that look for you? What are those foods like tell me a little bit about your experience, I guess.
There's so much that I want to unpack about food and race that I haven't done so much on my platform because of fear, because of feeling vulnerable, because these conversations are not happening, and needing to take care of my mental health. But I do want to say here, and I want to really accentuate that Mexico and the United States have a long history, right? This was Mexico. And if we acknowledge that the Southwest has a very strong, relationship with the United States, to talk about, like, even right now, you're asking me such a simple question, but I have to go back to history. Like, for me as a sociologist and as someone living in these borderlands, is understanding how people of Mexican descent have been racialized in this country. Like, food is intricately connected to identity,
right?
To so much stuff. So I really want to center that folks of Latino background, of Hispanic or Mexican American background, have experienced different forms of discrimination throughout history. And when I elevate our culture foods, is elevating our identities, is like elevating like our cultural resiliency. It's like we are surviving in a racist society. Like has been so much systematic exclusion since 1848. Mexican Americans were denied their citizenship rights. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo said, "You're citizens." They became foreigners in their own land. And this gets me so emotional, because there were racist laws. Like, Mexicans were lynched throughout the Southwest in the 1800s. So to talk about my culture of foods is like, I need to acknowledge or how our brown bodies have been racialized in this country, and how people continue to see some of our culture foods as inferior. Maybe it's not discussed that way, but how the health industry, how diet culture, like how they're healthifying a burrito to a wrap or something else. Like, people don't see it. For me, it's like so layered and so deep.
They strip the culture away from it.
Totally. And it's a way, and so that touches on too why assimilation and acculturation, like feeling embarrassed growing up of eating my culture foods. For me, I had to learn English in this country. I was bullied for not speaking English. I was undocumented for, part of my childhood. That all shapes my identity as a child, as a girl, as a Mexicana. And growing up, in Watsonville, and looking at the farm workers who are picking our crops. So it's like, you're trying to see like who you are in this country, and then you look at your community and the type of work that they're doing, and then you see the rhetoric in this country about immigrants, and then yes, people love Mexican food, but they're anti-immigrant. Right.
Yeah.
So I think I answered your question a little bit complicated.
Yeah.
No, but you make us. I mean, I want to like reiterate that. Like in California, where we have the best Mexican food in California. You know how easy for us to say that, and then to not be respectful and creating better
Recognize where that
lives
comes from.
for the people who are in our culture that are of that descent and who have contributed to our society so much. Like you mentioned, farm workers. My gosh, like our society would completely crumble without those people.
You know,
and we have so little respect for them.
Santa Cruz County, Monterey County, Monterey County produces 70% of the lettuce of the entire United States.
So crazy.
Watsonville, you know, it's the strawberry capital, like Castroville, the capital of our artichokes. Like we're in a multi-billion-dollar industry of agriculture, yet farm workers continue to experience food insecurity, housing insecurity. Women experience, immigrant women experience sexual harassment, right? And here we are in other spaces, gentrifying communities and the food and elevating. We don't need our culture foods to be elevated,
right,
so that other people.
Or for it to be shamed that they're not good for you if you eat them this way.
Well, I think that like that is like what you're saying is like there's a perception, whether we're conscious of it or not. I believe most of us are just acting unconsciously, which is not an excuse. But I think what you're saying is like there's this perception that the food is less than. And like what I think you're asking for and what I think your community deserves is to look through the lens of like, look at how resilient this community is under all the oppression they have faced.
Wow.
It's like, I feel like that shift alone in looking through the lens of like, look at how incredible this community is and this culture is for being able to have this level of resiliency under the, like a white person, I'm sorry, would not be able to, you know what I mean? To go from the white privilege that someone might have today and then to be put in that environment, I mean, they would crumple.
Yes.
They would crumble. And so to shift the perception from to resiliency and an amazing community, and like there's so many beautiful things that are, and I feel like it really upsets me that it's viewed anything outside of that, and so I'm
so for me, you know, it is just to enforce is it's not just like elevating like all culture foods or giving the middle finger to diet culture. Like, yes, you can eat your tortillas. Tortillas doesn't necessarily, you know, it's not the result of diabetes or other things. There's other external factors. It's elevating our culture foods, but for me, it's elevating people's identity. It's like their resiliency, you can acculturate into this country. I'm acculturated, but I'm proud of my foods, and I don't want to. We're already shamed for the bodies that we have, for our skin color, for what other factors. We're already shamed, and then added, then people are shaming you shouldn't be eating your culture foods. For me, it's a resistance. It's to resist, and also people internalize that even beans. You know, burritos have beans. Beans. Many people don't want to eat beans because, like, that's food of the Latinos. That's food of the poor. Like, even beans are racialized. People don't realize that. It's crazy.
Yeah. Just such a lack of reverence and respect and curiosity.
Something else I wanted to bring up too with you, since we have you here, and I'm so grateful for your voice, is like, you know, we are attempting to bring awareness on our podcast and through what we do in our business around treating your body with love and care and respect and all those things, and like making food choices from that place. And one thing I think that I see a lot on the internet is white women walking into spaces that previously belonged to marginalized communities. For instance, like the body acceptance movement, which was started by a Black woman, and now like if you go to that hashtag on Instagram, it is filled with thin, able-bodied white women. Absolutely. And obviously I believe that everyone deserves to like be able to step into self-acceptance and love. But like even in the eating disorder community, for instance, there's like a lot of, it comes from kind of a frame of whiteness. And so like how can we and I know that there might not be like there is not a simple answer to this, but how can we create space for people who are like, yeah, I see that you're suffering from that, but you're also, again, that marginalization is the privilege I still experience as a white woman who has a thin, abled body.
Yes.
I still am like, oh, I suffer from diet culture, but it's not as bad for me
Yes.
as it is for someone else.
Thank
and how can I
you.
see that?
You know, excellent. And I've been noticing the same thing, you know, on just how body liberation and body positivity has been co-opted by thin, mainly cisgender women. And I think where it becomes very problematic, one is not acknowledging the roots of body positivity and where it comes from, and that it was rooted on Black women, trans women, women in bigger bodies, like why that was important. That's one I think people need to acknowledge and give credit, because that has been lost. And then secondly, I've heard, and I see that in social media, that we already acknowledge that we experience different forms of oppression, right? It's very different for a white woman to say that they've been oppressed by diet culture or that they've been oppressed by dieting. You know, that's where I feel like, oh, that's a little stretchy there. You know, why? Because that's at the individual level as a person, but systematically as a group, you know, let's take, you know, Black women historically, and, you know, women of color have historically experienced oppression and systematic exclusion. So the way that they experience oppression from diet culture is very different from a thin white woman. So I think we gotta be careful. Like I see those conversations happening in social media. White women can't be oppressed by dieting. That's not how it works.
Because,
and that
like,
deviates.
Can you highlight the difference?
Because as I
We're
said,
part of the system to some degree.
yes, because you're part of the dominant society as white folks, and because anti-Blackness and fat phobia are rooted, right? That's the emergence of diet culture in this country. Because one Black women of color haven't always been used. White women have been the standard, right? So that's why. So fat phobia and anti-Blackness is rooted in white supremacy. And by the mere fact of just being white woman, you are part of that dominant society. So Black women were excluded from notions of beauty. Black women and women of color, indigenous, Latina women have been excluded. That's what we mean. Like, it's based on you're
saying that traditionally a woman of color would not be used as like the image.
And it's still not.
Yeah.
And it's still not in a lot of these spaces. So yes.
So are you saying that I want to make sure I really understand
I know
this.
I'm not being very articulate.
No, you definitely are.
No, you are.
We need to dumb it down for ourselves.
Like, the standard of measurement is how you say Black women have, or I don't know if I'm saying it though, it's my Spanish, thinking in Spanish and trying to talk in English is white femininity, white beauty is in relation to Blackness, is in relation to indigenous women, is in relation to Latina women.
So are you saying that we can't be oppressed by something we created?
You can feel a different level of oppression, right? Remember, because we talked about different levels of oppression.
Yeah.
You can be oppressed by a white male.
Yes.
You can be oppressed by that system of patriarchy, of misogyny, right?
Yes.
Yes, absolutely. But not based on race, not based, well, depending on other intersections.
I see.
And the diet culture piece, I think, like if you think, when I think about diet culture, and I'm going to call her out right now, but like I think of Gwyneth Paltrow and like the goop thing.
Here
Like
we go.
I think about the bone broth thing we just saw over TikTok. Like that's what I
Yeah.
think about. And like she's doing those things from this place of like, I need to be thin, but she is the standard. Like
Yes.
she is the like example on the chalkboard of we should all look like this. If you're brown, you should look like that. If you're bigger, you should look like that. Like you should be blonde and white and tall and thin and all the things. And like that for white women, like while we might experience individually, I think I heard you mention
Yes,
this,
at the
I
individual level.
individually experience shame around my body sometimes, which I think all people do, but that like I am not oppressed by the system of it in the same way because I am considered the standard in this
Yes,
country.
unless you're a white woman in a bigger body
Right.
who continuously is disenfranchised and discriminated in the airport, in the
Because of the
health
size of her body.
profession. Absolutely.
I see what you're saying. That's really good distinction. Thank you
Okay.
for that.
Yeah.
Okay, that's helpful.
People, are you saying, let me just refine this even more and see if I can say it. Are you saying that people can't feel discriminated by someone who is classified as like, I don't want to use this word, so forgive me, but traditionally like lower on the hierarchy of things. Is that what you're saying? So somebody is looking at an image of a thin white female, and she's a thin white female. It's like, yeah, what's
you're
what
saying
are you
it's a different
about?
magnitude of
Yes.
oppression that we
Yeah.
have to recognize.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Just
that's
like
right.
I'm saying, like I feel my oppression as a woman next to you as a male, but
Yes.
that oppression is different than you as a woman
Exactly,
and
as a
having
woman
other
of color.
factors as
Yeah.
well.
Diet culture
Absolutely.
affects us differently than it affects
Exactly.
It's the magnitude of the oppression.
Yeah, it's the
Thank you.
magnitude of the oppression.
I feel like the way I
And-
described that was horrible, by the way,
you
but
did.
I'm trying my
Cut
best.
that.
We're all trying
We don't- I feel like part of what we also have to do, and what I wish I would have said in the beginning as well, is we need to be okay to make mistakes.
Yes.
Oh, fact.
me too.
Because otherwise we're
And
never
apologize for
gonna,
them.
but because we're not going to get anywhere. I think we hide behind fear so much. Like I don't
Yes.
want to talk about this because am I going to say it the right way?
Right, yes.
Yeah.
And only when we screw up, right? Or we would make that mistake. Absolutely. It's acknowledging that we all experience different forms of marginalization, disenfranchisement, and oppression. And that for racialized groups, that oppression has been systematic. That means that it has been throughout time, throughout history, and that it's embedded in our institutions.
Something you talk about also, I'm just stalking your social media, by the way, but something you talk about in your podcast and social media is divesting from diet culture. And like that word, I kind of know what that means. I would love to know more. Maybe you
Yes.
could explain that for me in simple terms.
Absolutely.
But I would like to do that. So
Yes.
if I could have some guidance, that'd be helpful. Maybe our listeners could
I
benefit
know.
as well.
I'm still working on that too. So first, I think dismantling diet culture for me as a sociologist and as a woman of color, like through my lens, is in an utopian world, it would be like eradicate the actual system, right? But I know that's impossible because it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. So what can we do? For me, then, dismantling is at the individual level, having these conversations, unlearning what we know about bodies, right? Because so even when I think about my life as a Mexicana, as a woman who's brown, that there's different shades of brown in my family. The spectrum of colorism is in my family from darker morena, darker skin, to lighter, to white passing. So when I mean by divesting from diet culture, I mean by looking at the individual level, divesting from these, like you said, collective ideas that are oppressive, right? So for me is divesting from notions of beauty, divesting of what it means to be beautiful and accepted, even the notion of professionalism too, that is rooted on white supremacy. So divesting from all these dominant ideas is really challenging them. That's like one big layer. The second one is, I am still working on loving myself. I don't think I'll ever get there because of this society that we live in that constantly reminds me of my place in this hierarchy. Like, how am I going to love my body when you're telling me I'm not good enough? Or you tell me X, Y, and Z, So those are factors. So divesting from diet culture is also unapologetic. I'm working on that. Being unapologetic about who you are and your multiple intersecting identities.
Authenticity is so important. It's so hard.
Because yes, it is so hard, especially if you're a person of color, if you're queer.
If your
being
authenticity
authentic,
isn't accepted,
it's not
right?
accepted.
It's not the
like
standard, yeah.
how, like
It's like a privilege that you get to be the most
Yes.
authentic version of you, right?
That's
Because
scary.
because
There's no danger.
There's no danger.
Exactly. Right.
There's no danger.
You can't say that to a black male. You
Yeah.
can't say that to a black trans woman or undocumented immigrant. Be your most authentic self. Come out. You're undocumented. You're DACA. No, that's so
There's like
insensitive.
physical danger to
There's
that.
physical danger. People can lose their life for being authentic. So when you say divesting from diet culture, and I say that it is being unapologetic, being who you are, but being aware that we still live within certain constraints in society. Divesting from diet culture also means where we spend our money, like we don't need to buy the avocado toast or the quinoa or that super or whatever green smoothie or whatever it is, like that diet culture has healthified, right? So divesting is, moving away from the health is divesting from diet culture is what we're doing, having these conversations that necessarily don't happen in other spaces. Divesting from diet culture is also acknowledging where food comes from, acknowledging the land, acknowledging our ancestors, our original stewards of these lands. It's divesting from diet culture is about food justice, is about immigrant rights. So that's just a couple of things.
Just a couple. We'll just make a
something
list.
you said that I feel really
thank
just
you.
opened my eyes was this idea around us trying to deliver a message of people coming home to themselves and being their most authentic expression of who they are. And what you're saying is that yes, and we also need to have these conversations because what a privilege it is for me to be able to even give that recommendation, right? And so we have to have the conversations because me coming home to me and being the most authentic expression of me
It's a lot less
might be
friction.
very dangerous for somebody else.
Absolutely. I know you had said earlier also, when I think about body, and that's what's missing in the body positivity, how it's been co-opted and just love yourself and these affirmations. I'm like, shit, I wish that would work for me. It doesn't work when you get a rejection after rejection in academia or whatever. You realize, you internalize like, I'm not good enough, like, or all this and that. And you're asking me that I need to love my body when other people are scrutinizing or talking about my body, even reproductive rights. Women of color have historically, women were sterilized without their consent. Black women, indigenous women, Latina women, and so even that comes into body positivity of reproductive rights. Like, love your body, but wait, my body has been violated. My body has experienced violence. People in my ethnic or racial group have experienced violence. How can you tell me just love your body? That's why Sonia Taylor says radical self-love. She changes that narrative, right? She's shifting that narrative and saying radical self-love. And that radical self-love is centered understanding systems of oppression. It is centered on liberation. And so that body liberation is grounded on social and racial justice.
Something popped into my head as you said that. I know we're short on time here. But, it seems to me that we all go through this experience in the world. And a lot of people, everybody has things that happen to them. And the more of these things that you diverge from the ideal or the standard, the more these things happen to you. And so there's more to overcome, right? So a woman who is of color, who was overweight, who grew up in a poor community, who maybe has a different sexuality and whatnot, the amount of things that person has been told to not love themselves for is so much greater than someone like myself who shows up in this world and people are like, you can do what you want, right? And I think that's such an important thing for people to be aware of, is that one person might have 1,000,000 reasons to not love themselves and another maybe only 1,000. And that means that's going to be a lot harder. And if we want that to be fair, we have to change the entire way we look at society.
By empowering people to come home to themselves, but by having these conversations of like, we understand that we're coming from this lens, and this lens is a very privileged lens. And so we need to acknowledge that this privilege doesn't exist for everyone, and have meaningful conversations like this to bring awareness to the full true story. I think what is really coming out now, which is hard but also necessary, is truth. Truth is starting to come out.
It's always been there, but we've been like, don't look at it, don't talk about it.
Well, I would love to have you back on for
please.
a second one, because I have this
or
one
a third
question.
or a fourth.
I have a second question that's not going to get asked today, but it's just when you started out, you said education, and I couldn't help but think we are so afraid to tell the truth of history.
Oh, yeah.
And
well, that ethnic studies is still banned in some states.
It's lies.
Right.
What you learn in the textbooks in school.
Right. And that's really sad. That's really sad that we can't tell the truth of history, because I know that when I try to tell at least my best version of the truth to my children, they see oppression for what it is immediately. Kids don't see it the way that adults do, because they're in that phase of being conditioned. And if we can teach them, hey, this is what really happened, and then they can just relate to that from a human experience, because that's where they're starting from, it's so much easier than having to unwind it when someone's older.
Exactly.
And that's where the real change comes, right? It's because when we can change on the individual level, like you're saying, if you have children, that impacts them, and it impacts their ability to operate in a world in a different place. And that is the future. I mean, that really is. So the intersection of work on yourself combined with education, there's so much to be talked about.
All of the systems,
Yeah. So I just want to offer you so much respect and reverence and appreciation for coming to meet with us today and being willing to be vulnerable and having these conversations, because I believe they are super important. And I just, again, have so much respect for you. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I appreciate it. I really do.
Thank
wanna
you.
say,
So glad you were
I'm
here.
grateful that you're here, and it really breaks my heart to hear the experiences that you had.
Yes, and
Because-
this is just touching the surface.
I know,
Yeah.
I know. We
know.
need like
We need
years.
a little bit,
We need
yeah.
years.
Yeah, you're right. I can't do a lot of Donald Trump.
But we will absolutely put all of your information in our show notes so people can find out where to find you. And we really hope to have you back.
Absolutely.
And thank you so much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you for
Thank you.
inviting me.